The inquiry into the use of the Federal Emergencies Act continues this week, and the commission heard from a number of high-level local and provincial police officials, painting a picture of a police response in disarray.
This was from the very onset a national issue. Why wasn't I getting intelligence threat risk assessments on a regular basis of the quality that I got from the OPP, from our federal partners?
I had no reason not to agree with Chief Sloly. It certainly had turned into a situation that I felt Ottawa police had not anticipated, and I do not think describing it as an occupation would be inaccurate at all.
People creating an occupation that traumatizes our community was something that no community had ever seen, was unprecedented, and was the situation we're facing when we began to get the experience of these people.
Witnesses describe breakdowns in communication and transfers of chain of command in dealing with what's been described, as you heard there, as an occupation of Canada's capital city. The Power Panel is here now. Nigan Sinclair from the Winnipeg Free Press and Paul Wells, journalist and author, Marie Vastel from Le Devoir, and the CBC's JP Tasker. They join me in studio. So JP, we're a week and a half, 2 weeks into this. It's a bit like the occupation itself. You lose track of time. Where do you think we are in our understanding of how all this happened and whether or not the Emergencies Act was required to stop it from continuing?
Well, we have heard witness after witness after witness say that they did not need the Emergencies Act, right? They essentially said that they thought they could do the job without it. But we've also heard testimony, and you've pointed this out in your reporting, David, that they also did use the Emergencies Act when it was available to them. So there is a bit of a contradiction there. And I think the question for me is, if they say they didn't need it, why didn't they get this thing cleared out sooner? I mean, this is obviously a reflection of poor policing in this city. I found Peter Sloly today unbelievable and disingenuous. I think his whole shtick that they didn't have the intelligence that this was going to be an occupation, they were going to dig in for a few weeks to be crazy. Because we know the Hotel Association was warning them, right, as this was all starting, that they had bookings for a month from some of the Convoy people. So at least somebody knew that this was not going to be over in one weekend, one and done. But I think, though, when it comes to politics, obviously the government wants all the witnesses to say, yeah, thanks, Trudeau. We're so happy you invoked that Emergencies Act. They're not getting it. But I don't think it's all that damaging politically to anyone. I don't think that there's a lot of votes to get from this whole charade, if you will. I mean, I think that the Conservatives can't really pounce on it all that well and capitalize on some of the shortcomings because they don't want to tie Pierre Poilievre to the trucker convoy any more than they already have, right? And I think they just want to put this behind them. In question period all week, I don't think I heard one single question from a Conservative about some of the things that were revealed at this committee this week.
No, that's an interesting point. And Nigan, I'm not sure there's a lot of undecideds left on what happened, during the vaccine protests. But I wonder, get your perspective on the police constantly saying they hadn't exhausted all options, yet also we were told that officers were told not to issue tickets, not to make arrests, not to intercept gas supplies, not to use or attempt options because of the environment and the threat to their personal safety. Should they act that way?
Well, Brenda Lucki sure thought so earlier this week by saying, in an email directly that there were other options to use and without the Emergencies Act, and those were just not taken up. I mean, there was something very interesting that was said in Peter Sloly's testifying today, and that what he said is that they were focusing more on the approach that they would typically take, where of a temporary occupation, which is building relationships, which is standing nearby but not intervening. Right. I mean, it's a real problematic way to approach the issue when it's very clear that that's not really what the police were doing. What the police were doing were, as we're being seen throughout the different emails that have been released, is they were really in disarray, almost like they had no prior template to look at what a protest would look like. Whereas throughout all different instances in Ottawa, there's frequently secret security briefings, particularly when it comes to issues involving Indigenous peoples and others who have come to the downtown area to approach. And there is a strategic plan put into place where there is tear gas, where there is very quickly a blockade set up by the police to protect certain areas and so on. So it's very disingenuous. And I completely agree that Peter Sloly's testifying today it was almost as if he kept painting himself as an outsider coming coming from Toronto, but then he also was painting himself as completely incapable of being able to handle an event like this, or be able to handle really leading up police in a large city. It's a real disappointment, and it also shows that, if anything, through all of these different emails, it really shows that policing in this country and in major urban cities really have a lot of organization to consider.
No, it is, Marie, it's definitely not been a good couple of weeks for the Ottawa Police Service.
Yeah.
But, you know, what I found kind of bewildering today from Chief Sloly's testimony was that even now, after everything that happened and the clarity that we're getting from these intelligence reports from the OPP about what was coming, he still insists there was no way to know it was going to be this big and last this long.
Yeah.
And it seems inconceivable. Maybe that word doesn't mean what I think it means, but it seems inconceivable to me that you could take that position at this point.
I mean, I think it was expected that Peter Sloly would be on the defensive today. He's just spent 10 days, or is this day 11, of watching his former colleagues say it's all his fault and he didn't know what he was doing. So I think his behavior was expected, but I don't know if it's well received. Just as the fact that he says that, well, the federal government should have given him more intelligence reports and briefings. Well, you had some from the OPP, and you didn't read them. He said he left it to his subordinates, and then one of them, I believe, was from January 13, which is 2 weeks before the first trucks arrived. And he didn't read them. When he did read them, he didn't believe them, because he said still in the wake of them arriving, oh, I didn't realize, you know, it would look like that. Well, first of all, you did have OPP briefings, and you could have gone on Twitter or somewhere and see what these people were preparing. Right. He also keeps comparing it to when there's talk of warnings of, you know, people perhaps having weapons, or people perhaps being organized to have food and fuel and water and really entrenching themselves. He says, well, there's always that risk in any major event, except people don't come to Ottawa with big rigs on Canada Day. It just, the whole thing was really hard to believe. And I don't think that his testimony helped dissipate the notion that he was in over his head and that the Ottawa police was in disarray, and we haven't even gotten to cross-examination yet. This was the Commission's lawyers. So I'm interested to see what he has to say on Monday, and also, if anything, this kind of helps the government, quite frankly, at least politically. We'll see the legal bar of the Commission, but politically, it looks like no one was doing anything.
Well, on that point, I mean, you know, the machinations of what's happening inside the Ottawa Police Service, Paul, and the text from Brenda Lucky is all salacious and interesting, but the central question here is whether the bar was met, right, for invoking the Emergencies Act. And I don't know the answer to that yet, but my question that comes out of this is, what is a federal government supposed to do when all the lower orders seem to be failing or not acting?
And it's a peculiarity of the way the witnesses are questioned by Commission counsel that we never seem to really get satisfaction on that question. Right. Every day, the new witnesses, tell us how you grew up. What were you doing in 2019? Tell us about the weeks before the convoy. And then they break for lunch. The day's half gone. And like at the end of the day, it's like, hey, did you need that Emergencies Act? So my general advice to the Commission counsel is switch it up a bit. Maybe start with the Emergencies Act.
They want you to keep tuning in. That's why.
It's pretty clear that they were going from, they were looking at the reports, but the Ottawa police, who deal with a lot of protests in the nation's capital, and occasionally have dealt with heavy equipment on Parliament Hill. We've all seen that before. They thought that this was going to be like that, and they didn't take seriously the other stuff. On the Emergencies Act, any number of police can testify that it was useful, or that it helped, or that it was handy. But the Emergencies Act itself says that's not enough. The Emergencies Act says that if any other law would have sufficed, then you can't use this one. And I still don't think there have been days when we've seen closer or further away from an answer to that question, but I think most people who've been watching would say we still don't really have an answer on that question.
But there's that disconnect, right? That if all these other laws were available, what were you doing?
See, to me, that's easy. They spent 3 weeks finding their asses. They spent 3 weeks getting their act together in the most minimal fashion. But the evidence, I think, is credible that about the time the Emergencies Act was invoked, they had their act together. But
yes, the scaffolding was being built. You could see that when Superintendent Bernier was put in charge.
Out there on Twitter, I know there's millions of people who disagree with me. Hi.
Yeah. Well, yes. We'll see if they're still there after the new management. But, you know, JP, just going back to this last point, though, of Sloly still insisting that there was no way to know. I mean, and I guess outside of reading their manifesto, listening to literally every public utterance they were making, and all of the news interviews they did as they came towards the country, I just don't know how you can credibly even try to make that argument, knowing what we knew in advance and knowing what happened.
Yeah, I mean, his other point, too, that I found laughable was him saying, well, it's the media's fault that people lost trust in the police in the city of Ottawa. And I think, no, you just had to leave your house and see what was going on to know the police were not doing their job. You didn't have to watch the television to find that one out. You know, I think that, he's clearly delusional, frankly. I don't think he really understands, like, where he's at and what his role was in all of this. But just on one quick thing on the Emergencies Act, whether it was actually necessary or not, we know that it worked, right? We know that symbolically, at least, it was enough to kind of bust heads, to crack down, to get people out of the center core. And whether that meets the legal bar, I don't know, but it certainly was effective in actually ending this whole thing. And even if they could use the powers and the provincial legislation and all this, I do think that it was effective, right? And they can draw that conclusion from this.